On the morning of April 17th, 1948, a cargo ship called the SS John H. Quick pulled out of the port of Galveston, Texas, loaded with wheat. 9 days later, it docked in Bordeaux, France, and the American ambassador, Jefferson Caffery, stood on the pier and gave a speech. Bands played. Photographers lined up. French officials shook hands with American officials for the cameras. It was reported, accurately enough, as an act of charity, the first shipment of the Marshall Plan sent to feed a starving continent. What the cameras didn't capture was the paperwork sitting in a filing cabinet back in Washington. A clause requiring the French government to deposit the equivalent value of that wheat in French francs into a special account that the United States would help control. That single ship carried a few $1 million of grain. Over the next 4 years, the country would send more than $13 billion to Europe under the same terms, worth well over $100 billion in today's money. And nearly every dollar came wrapped in conditions that gave Washington a say in how Europe rebuilt itself, who governed it, and where its trade would flow. This is the story of how the most celebrated aid program in American history also became one of its most effective tools of financial control. The roots of the plan go back further than most people assume. Not to 1947, but to the ruins of 1945. When the war ended, Europe's industrial base was in pieces. Railways were bombed out. Currencies had collapsed into near worthlessness, with black market exchange rates running many multiples above official ones. Coal production in the Ruhr, the industrial heart of what would become West Germany, had fallen to a fraction of its pre-war output, and coal was the fuel that ran everything else. Steel mills, power plants, railways, home heating. Then came the winter of 1946 and in 1947, one of the coldest of the century. Rivers froze solid across northern Europe. Barge traffic, which moved much of the continent's coal and grain, simply stopped. Britain's coal stocks ran so low that factories shut down for weeks, and bread rationing, something that hadn't even been necessary during the war itself, was introduced in 1946. Displaced persons camps across occupied Germany and Austria still held hundreds of thousands of refugees with nowhere to go. American occupation policy itself was already shifting under this pressure. In September 1946, Secretary of State James Burns traveled to the ruined city of Stuttgart and delivered what became known as the Speech of Hope, publicly reversing the harsher, deliberately punitive occupation policy that had governed defeated Germany since 1945 and signaling that Washington now wanted German industry back on its feet, not permanently dismantled. A few months later, former President Herbert Hoover, sent by Truman on a fact-finding mission through the American and British occupation zones, returned home and recommended lifting the industrial production caps still imposed on German factories, warning bluntly that a deindustrialized Germany sitting in the middle of the continent would only prolong Europe's economic misery rather than punish anyone constructively. Both moves, months before Marshall's speech, quietly laid the groundwork for treating a rebuilt German economy as part of the solution rather than the crime still being paid for. Washington had already tried simple relief. Between the war's end and early 1947, the United States funneled roughly $13 billion in emergency aid to Europe through direct loans, occupation zone relief programs, and contributions to the new United Nations Relief Agency, a sum comparable to the entire Marshall Plan that followed, and yet the continent kept sliding backward. The reason was structural, and it's worth understanding clearly because it's the same mechanism that later gave the plan its leverage. Europe had almost no dollars left, and dollars were what the post-war world's trade actually ran on. Without dollars, European governments couldn't buy American coal, American machine tools, or American wheat, even though American warehouses were full of exactly those goods. And without those imports, factories couldn't restart. And without restarted factories, there were no exports to earn the dollars back. Economists at the time called it the dollar gap. And by early 1947, it looked less like a temporary shortage and more like a structural trap with no way out. There was also a harder, colder calculation sitting underneath the humanitarian one. By early 1947, communist parties were gaining real electoral strength in France and Italy, both of which had large, war-tested communist movements with deep roots in organized labor from the resistance years. In February of that year, a note arrived in Washington. The exhausted British government could no longer afford to prop up the governments of Greece and Turkey against internal insurgency and outside pressure, effectively handing the strategic burden to the United States overnight. That shock pushed President Truman to articulate what became known as the Truman Doctrine 2 months later, committing American support to any nation resisting communist pressure. American planners, under Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who laid out the economic argument in a low-key speech in Cleveland, Mississippi that May, and George Kennan, the State Department's chief Soviet strategist, who had just sent Washington his famous long telegram, analyzing Soviet behavior, concluded that hunger and economic despair, not invading tanks, were communism's most effective recruiting tool in Western Europe. An economically desperate France, or Italy, was a France or Italy at real risk of voting communist governments into power through the ballot box, not losing one to an army. Historians still debate how much of the plan's motivation was genuine humanitarian concern versus Cold War containment strategy. The honest answer, visible in the internal State Department memos of the period, is that both were present from the start and reinforced each other at every turn. Secretary of State George Marshall laid the proposal out in public for the first time on June 5, 1947, at Harvard University's commencement, in a speech so understated that reporters almost missed its significance. He spoke for barely 10 minutes and made almost no headlines the next day. Marshall's actual words were deliberately vague. American aid, he said, should go toward the revival of a working economy in the world, and he pointedly invited the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to participate, a calculated move that put the political burden of refusal on Moscow rather than Washington. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, listening to a radio broadcast of the speech, reportedly recognized its significance immediately and moved within days to organize a European response before the offer could evaporate. It worked almost exactly as Marshall's advisors hoped. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov attended an initial planning conference in Paris that July with a large delegation of economic experts, but walked out within days once it became clear that participation required opening Soviet and Eastern Bloc economic data to outside inspection, a level of transparency Stalin was never going to accept. The Soviets answered a year later with their own program, the Molotov Plan, formalizing the economic split of the continent into two competing blocs. Czechoslovakia's coalition government, which was not yet fully under Soviet control and genuinely wanted to accept the American offer, voted to participate, and was then summoned to Moscow and forced to publicly withdraw. That humiliation contributed directly to the communist coup that seized full control of Czechoslovakia in February 1948. Less than 2 months before Marshall's Plan was even signed into American law. 16 Western European nations sent delegations to Paris that summer of 1947 to form the Committee of European Economic Cooperation, tasked with drafting a joint request for how much American money Europe actually needed. Their first estimate, submitted that September, asked for roughly $29 billion over 4 years to close the dollar gap entirely. American officials considered that figure politically impossible to get through a Republican-controlled Congress already wary of foreign spending, and the request was negotiated down before it ever reached a formal vote. By the time the Economic Cooperation Act passed the following spring, the number on paper had been cut to something Congress could actually stomach, and even that reduced figure barely survived the legislative process intact. Congress authorized the program on April 3rd, 1948, under the Economic Cooperation Act, and the agency built to run it, the Economic Cooperation Administration, headed by former Studebaker Corporation President Paul Hoffman, set to work immediately. 16 Western European countries, plus the Western-occupied zones of Germany, were folded into a new body called the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, the OEC, which the United States insisted the Europeans run jointly rather than negotiate with individually, country by country. That single design decision mattered enormously. by forcing Britain, France, the Low Countries, and the others to sit at one table and divide the money among themselves, Washington effectively compelled a level of continental economic coordination that had never existed before, the direct ancestor of the post-war European integration project that would eventually become the European Union. Here is where the plan's real financial architecture becomes visible, and it's worth walking through slowly because this is the piece almost nobody outside economic historians actually understands. American aid was not simply handed over in cash. It arrived almost entirely as commodities and goods: wheat, coal, machinery, cotton, petroleum, tobacco, purchased from American producers and shipped under a rule written directly into the authorizing legislation, with roughly half the cargo tonnage carried on American flag vessels, a requirement that quietly subsidized the struggling U.S. merchant marine on every single voyage. European governments then sold those goods into their own domestic markets, to farmers, factory owners, and retailers, collecting payment in their own local currency: francs, lira, guilders, kroner. Under the terms every recipient government had to sign, that local currency could not simply be spent by the recipient country as it wished. It had to be deposited into a segregated account called a counterpart fund, held at each country's own central bank. A slice of every counterpart fund, typically around 5%, belonged outright to the United States, to cover its own embassy and mission operations abroad and to purchase strategic raw materials it wanted, including uranium or from the Belgian Congo for the nascent American nuclear program. The remaining balance, the overwhelming majority of the fund, could only be released for domestic investment with a formal sign-off of the American mission stationed in that country. In effect, the United States had built a lever that let it reach directly into European national budgets, without spending a single additional dollar beyond the original shipment, and helped decide which reconstruction projects moved forward and which did not. A dollar left in American port as a ton of wheat became francs sitting in a Paris vault and came back out months later as American approved infrastructure spending, all while that original dollar had already done its first job simply by paying an American farmer or ship owner. That closed loop, repeated across 16 countries for 4 straight years, is the actual engine of the Marshall Plan. Not simple charity, but a self-financing system of continuous leverage that cost Washington almost nothing beyond the initial goods themselves. The money itself was never split evenly, and the split tells its own story about priorities. Of the roughly $13 billion disbursed by the time the program wound down, Britain received the single largest share, close to a quarter of the total, followed by France at just over 20% and Italy at a little over 11%. The Netherlands, Greece, and Austria each received meaningful shares as well, while smaller or less strategically central participants like Portugal and Iceland received a small fraction of 1%. 2 countries that might have used the aid badly were deliberately left out entirely. Spain, still run by the fascist dictator Francisco Franco, was excluded on political grounds until Cold War necessity brought Washington back to negotiate directly with Madrid a few years later. And Finland, wedged against the Soviet border, quietly declined to apply at all rather than provoke Moscow. The exploitation of that leverage showed up almost immediately, and it showed up first in politics rather than in economics. In May 1947, a full month before Marshall's Harvard speech was even delivered, both the French and Italian governments, under direct and sustained American pressure, expelled the Communist Party ministers who had been sitting in their post-war coalition cabinets since liberation. The timing was no coincidence. American diplomatic cables from the period, since declassified and available through the State Department's own historical archive, made explicit that continued goodwill and future aid depended on excluding communists from real governing power inside those cabinets. When Italy held its pivotal national election in April 1948, the stakes became a full-blown covert operation. The CIA, in one of its very first political actions as a new agency, funneled several $1 million to Alcide de Gasperi's Christian Democratic Party to help defeat Palmiro Togliatti's Italian Communist Party at the ballot box. Picture the scene in an Italian piazza that spring. American-funded posters lining the walls, showing sacks of wheat stamped with American flags beside grim warnings of empty shelves under communism, while parish priests read letters from Italian-American relatives urging their families back home to vote against the communists. In a coordinated grassroots letter-writing campaign organized quietly with State Department encouragement, the strategy worked. The Christian Democrats won decisively, and Italy stayed firmly inside the American sphere for the rest of the Cold War. The Counterpart fund leverage had darker, quieter uses too, ones that never made it onto a poster. France, still fighting a brutal and increasingly costly colonial war to hold onto Indochina, used a portion of its Counterpart fund allocations, with American officials fully aware, to help finance that war, even as Washington publicly distanced itself from European colonialism and insisted its aid was purely for civilian reconstruction. Picture a French finance ministry official in Paris in 1950, sitting across a table from an American ECA representative, negotiating not over hospitals or rail lines, but over how much of that year's Counterpart account could be quietly redirected toward the military budget bleeding money into the jungles of Southeast Asia. A war that would, within a few years of the plan's end, draw American forces into the same terrain under a different flag at a far higher cost. The aid built in large part to stabilize a peaceful continent was, in that specific instance, indirectly helping bankroll the opening chapter of a conflict that would eventually cost the United States dearly in blood and treasure of its own. The irony would have been almost too neat for fiction. Wheat grown in Kansas, shipped to Bordeaux to feed French civilians and rebuild French factories, indirectly freeing up French government revenue to pay for rifles and transport planes bound for rice paddies 8,000 miles away, a war Washington was, at that very moment, publicly insisting it wanted no part of. Distribution wasn't clean at the street level either. American and European investigators documented recurring cases in Italy and Greece where Marshall Plan commodities, cigarettes, sugar, canned meat, cotton textiles, were diverted before they reached rationed populations and resold on thriving black markets in cities like Naples and Athens, undercutting legitimate local merchants who couldn't compete with underpriced American surplus flooding in through informal channels. None of this was hidden from Washington. It showed up, in fact, in the plan's own internal audit trail, in reports filed by ECA field officers who flagged shipment discrepancies between what left American ports and what actually reached ration counters. Discrepancies that were noted, investigated in individual cases, and then largely absorbed into the cost of running a fast-moving continental program rather than treated as a reason to slow it down. The labor movement became another quiet battleground. In France, the powerful General Confederation of Labor, dominated by communist leadership, had the industrial muscle to paralyze ports and rail lines through strikes, and did, repeatedly, in late 1947, in direct opposition to accepting American aid on American terms. American labor officials, working through the AFL's Free Trade Union Committee and with informal coordination for Washington, funneled money and organizational support to help a breakaway, explicitly anti-communist union federation called Force Ouvrière split off in 1948, deliberately fracturing the French labor movement's unified opposition and ensuring that dockworkers kept unloading Marshall Plan cargo rather than blocking it on the piers. The reckoning for all of this was genuinely mixed, and mixed in a way that's instructive rather than simply damning. Congress kept close and continuous oversight throughout the program's life, and the ECA's own internal auditors investigated and publicly reported on procurement waste, on shipping overcharges by well-connected freight companies exploiting the 50% American flag requirement, and on the black market diversion cases in Southern Europe. A real, if imperfect, degree of institutional transparency that's unusual for a program of this scale and geopolitical importance. Paul Hoffman himself pushed back publicly, more than once, against congressional attempts to load the program with even more overt political strings than it already carried, arguing that heavy-handed conditions would poison European trust in the entire project and undermine the very stability the plan was meant to build. Congressional committees, including hearings chaired by members skeptical of the program's cost, summoned Hoffman and his staff repeatedly to justify individual line items, and the resulting public record, thousands of pages of testimony and audit findings, remains one of the most thoroughly documented aid programs in American history, specifically because Congress refused to simply write the checks and look away. But some things were never fixed, and a serious accounting has to say so plainly rather than gloss past it. The French Counterpart funds that helped finance the Indochina War were never meaningfully separated out, restricted, or independently audited for that specific use, despite the program's founding language explicitly promoting peaceful civilian reconstruction. West Germany, the same nation whose war machine had leveled the cities the plan was rebuilding across the rest of the continent, ultimately received roughly 10.5% of total Marshall Plan funds, a share that quietly angered officials in occupied countries like the Netherlands and Norway, who felt the balance of aid didn't fairly reflect who had actually suffered under German occupation for 4 or 5 years. And no serious post-war investigation ever fully audited how far the CIA's covert election spending in Italy blurred the line between the plan's stated economic mission and outright political interference in another country's internal democracy, because that spending by design and by law was never meant to appear on the ECA's public books in the first place. The direct institutional descendant of this machinery is still recognizable today, even if most people never connected the dots between them. The OEC that Washington compelled European governments to build together in 1948 evolved, in 1961, into the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which still coordinates economic and trade policy among the world's wealthiest democracies. And in that same year, 1961, President Kennedy signed the Foreign Assistance Act creating the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, explicitly built on the institutional lineage of the Economic Cooperation Administration and its Cold War successor agencies, designed to keep doing on a global scale what the Marshall Plan had pioneered on one continent. Using American aid dollars as a deliberate instrument of foreign policy leverage, not simply as charity. For more than 60 years, USAID carried that legacy forward, administering food aid, development loans, and disaster relief around the world, with strings that, while softer and less centralized than the old Counterpart fund system, still tied assistance closely to American strategic interests abroad. By the start of 2025, the agency employed roughly 15,000 people worldwide and was administering well over $100 billion in active contracts and programs spanning humanitarian relief, public health, and economic development across dozens of countries, a scale that, adjusted for the size of the post-war world economy, was not entirely out of proportion to what the original Marshall Plan had once moved through Europe. In the spring of 2025, that agency was dismantled. Following a sweeping review ordered early in a new administration, thousands of USAID contracts were terminated within weeks. A federal judge initially ruled that the shutdown likely violated the Constitution by bypassing Congress's authority over an agency it had created by law, and an appeals court later allowed the dismantling to proceed regardless. By July 1st, 2025, USAID formally ceased operating as an independent agency, its remaining functions and a shrunken staff absorbed into the State Department. A public health study published around the time of the closure warned that the funding cuts could contribute to millions of additional deaths worldwide in the years that followed, while officials defending the decision argued the 64-year-old agency had drifted far from serving core American interests and needed a fundamental reset. The agency's last confirmed administrator later described watching the closure as an act carried out, in her words, with what felt like deliberate cruelty toward the people who had built it. Whether the direct descendant of the machine George Marshall's 10-minute speech first set in motion should still exist in anything like its old form, or whether the entire 78-year-old model of aid as leverage was always overdue for a reckoning of its own, is a question the country is still actively arguing about right now, in real time. What happened in the 4 years after that ship docked in Bordeaux is not a simple story of American generosity, and it's not a simple story of American exploitation either. It's both tangled together in the same wheat shipments, The same Counterpart accounts, the same posters warning Italian voters what a communist government would cost them. Europe did rebuild, remarkably fast. Industrial output across the participating countries climbed well past pre-war levels within a few years. And $13 billion bought a level of stability that likely helped the continent avoid a second economic catastrophe stacked on top of the first. But that same money also bought Washington a standing seat inside European finance ministries, an effective veto over how reconstruction funds were spent, and a continent quietly reorganized to serve American strategic interests for the 4 decades of the Cold War that followed. If you want to understand how American power actually moved through the 20th century, you have to follow the wheat, not just the wars. Subscribe for the next investigation into the hidden financial machinery behind the history you thought you already knew.